Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's basic science primer given by Assistant Professor at University of Colorado's Dr. Thor Johnson. Dr. Thor Johnson attended medical school at Indiana University, where he graduated from his MD Ph.D. program in 2008. He attended University of California, San Francisco for radiology residency and interventional radiology fellowship. Dr. Johnson also completed a postdoctorate research fellowship from 2010 to 2011. He has achieved many awards in research, including from the RSNA, and his many publications highlight his work not only as an IR, but as a basic science researcher. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much. And basically the point of this lecture was to take some of the stuff that you really need to know from a basic science standpoint and make it more accessible so you know how to sort of get started with basic science research, because there's kind of a lot to learn. Obviously, this is not going to be comprehensive. You know, some PhD programs take 10 or 12 years to finish. But I just wanted to kind of give you some of the skills that you need to sort of lead yourself along the way if you didn't happen to do a PhD while you were in medical school or something, which, you know, I don't think is absolutely necessary, to be perfectly honest. My favorite researcher is actually a guy at Johns Hopkins. His name is Hal Dietz, and he has an MD only, but he still managed to become a Howard Hughes investigator and is one of the best cardiologists at Johns Hopkins. So I think you can do great research as an MD, and that's kind of what this lecture is supposed to help you find some of the steps to get there. The thing that I'll tell you is the most important is actually persistence. There's a lot of people who are really talented, but research, even more than medicine, is much more about persistence than anything else. You really have to get good at being rejected, and you have to keep trying over and over again. And so the thing that I'll tell you, the first thing you should decide when you're thinking about doing research as a portion of your career is to decide sort of, okay, do I want to be a clinical researcher and do mostly research based on drugs or new devices in patients, or do I want to be a laboratory researcher, which kind of have different skill sets and sort of different training pathways that you need to do to get the stuff you need in order to continue to go. I will tell you, this is one of my favorite quotes. This actually came out of a very well-written paper on how to do a research career. And the beautiful thing about this is that most of you are actually MDs. And so this doesn't apply to you as much as it does to people who are PhDs. But the inexorable weight of scientific career pyramid squeezes out all but the most talented from getting the tenure track job that will offer you the chance of establishing your own laboratory. As a physician, you sort of are offered a job, you know, out of hand. You have to fight a little bit more for time, but you do have the benefit that there's a lot of programs designed to help you do research, because your research tends to translate into the health of the population a little bit more than the average PhDs. And you're not dependent on that research work in order to keep a job, which many people at research institutions who are PhDs are. And this is actually from a review in Natural in Cell Biology. So anyway, I think with that, now that I've depressed you all, I want to give you some of the paths. And we're talking about clinical research. Obviously, you're talking about taking care of patients and doing it in a way that you can discover something, change the way that the standard of care medicine is given to patients. And laboratory research, I would include both animal-based research as well as very basic science research into that same sort of bin. The first place that I think that you should really consider looking if you're interested in research is actually a tool that's published by the AAAS, which actually has a sort of personality trait assessment that you do in this program. And then it actually will sort of tell you about the kinds of research careers that you can do. And this is what the website looks like if you were to open it up and take a look at it. And you can see, you know, you plug in your interest through a brief assessment tool, and then it gives you the kinds of jobs that actually would be represented by those interests. And if you click and open some of these career path boxes, this is one for a principal investigator in a research-intensive institution. And you can see there's actually articles here that you can click on and open to read that are sort of vetted articles by very good scientists. And then there's a list of some books that could be helpful actually talking about the different parts of the work itself. And if you were to look at clinical research management, this is the kind of page that you would pull up, which actually talks about a little bit of clinical trials, and then some books as well, and professional societies that you can look to for help in actually developing this kind of career pathway. And so this is a very, very helpful site if you're, just starting out and not really sure about which kind of research you want to do, or sure but really want some more resources. So I would say, and if you look at that article that I mentioned earlier from Cell Biology, they actually said that the basic skill set of a good researcher, and they're talking mostly about laboratory research, is scientific knowledge, research skills, communication, leadership, management, professionalism, responsible conduct of research, and career development. And all of that sounds like gobbledygook to me, but so I would kind of put it in a different way. I think a basic skill set that anybody who truly wants to be an academic involves citation management, paper writing and reading, basic manipulation of data, and then presentation of that data to others. Because in academics, even when you're, basically a clinical IR doctor, you really do have to publish in order to get promoted. And so you really need some of these skill sets. And actually, being able to read and write the literature is also really good for your personal development to make sure that you stay up to date on all that's new in your specialty as you grow. For basic science, I would add on some extra skills that are required, including grant writing, experimental design, supervision and management of people, knowing how to write an IACUC, which I'll explain later, and then how to, since you are an MD, navigating the technology transfer field, because that's become increasingly more important, much more than I knew about when I was a graduate student. For clinical research, I'd say there's some other skills that are actually necessary, including knowing how to do all the city modules, navigating the IRB climate of your particular institution, and then some work in clinical trials design and regulatory environments, as well as sort of understanding how to navigate private industry partnerships. So I start with citation management because I think that one of the things that colleagues of mine who don't have a research background and are trying to write papers because they're now at an academic institution and they don't want to be an assistant professor for the rest of their lives, one of the things you really, really need to do is citation management. And I've seen people who write papers by just, putting the citations at the end of papers, even really, really great doctors. And it can be horribly painful and take you a lot of time. And so it takes some effort to learn how to use one of these citation management softwares, but it's really, really worth it. And there's actually 33 different programs that you can choose from. And the things that you really want to make sure is you should use the one that you're comfortable with if you already know how to use one. And you should try to be as good as you can with these programs, because they can be very helpful to you, not just from a research standpoint, but also clinically. But you need to make sure that it allows different output styles, by which I mean it doesn't just do one citation style. You need to be able to put in separate citations from the particular journal that you're trying to publish, because they all have requirements as to how you do your bibliography. And if you don't do it in that format, some journals will actually reject what you submit out of hand. But, and you also want to be able to switch those around. It must allow integration with word processing programs. It's totally useless if you can't use it in whichever word processing program you like to use. And then you should also allow you to search multiple online databases, because you don't want to hand enter all of these references into your library. You want to find them online, click on them, and have it automatically enter to your library. And you really want it to be compatible with both Mac and Windows operating system. There's some that are also compatible with Linux, but by and large, you may have collaborators that only use one or only use the other, and so you don't want them to not be able to work on the paper or add citations or look through citations because you both are using different operating systems and they're incompatible. And then you'd like it to have to be able to export a list of references. This is useful clinically when people are asking you for paper citations, but also you can send this to your collaborators in a particular project so that they have an idea of the literature on which you're working. So I myself use EndNote. I started using it when I was a grad student. When I was a grad student, there weren't that many reference managers available. The two dominant ones were Reference Manager and EndNote, and I didn't like Reference Manager. So I've been using EndNote the whole time. It's really intuitive, it's user-friendly, and as you can see, this is one of my chapters that I'm working on for a textbook, and it organizes all of your references, and these are clickable with hyperlinks, and I put the actual PDFs of the documents in this document, and so it's really easy for me to find them when I need to go back and look at those papers. And the search algorithm, as you can see, this gives you sort of 4 different potential searches right off the bat. And I tend to mostly use National Library of Medicine, PubMed, just the most useful. It's just the most useful among the different algorithms. And I search for the programs. It'll tell me if they have full text PDFs available online. And then I add the ones that I want to my library. Now, if I were a new guy, if I hadn't had experience using a reference manager before, I probably would go with something like Zotero. This is actually an online user reference that's completely free, except if you use up too much storage, you have to pay for some extra storage. But basically, it integrates with your browser, and then you can automatically add things to your different libraries. I'm locked in my ways, so obviously I'm not changing, but you know, it's a free reference and it actually is pretty intuitive and pretty well written, and it's kind of been written by multiple people, so it's a little more complicated than Excel, but actually, than EndNote, but it will give you all of the functionality of EndNote and the ability to cite in papers and all that sort of thing just from an installed program off the internet. So if I were you, and the references that I give you, the websites and such, I will have in a document that will be available afterwards, so you'll be able to look up all this stuff. But Zotero actually is the most functional of the different reference managers from the standpoint of integrating across the most platforms and all that sort of thing. So you can use Linux and all that sort of thing as well. The most important thing with citation management is it allows rapid citation in documents. It can cut hours off of your writing of papers, but also you can easily adjust the bibliography between different journals. It's easy to share references with colleagues, including clinical references. It allows the organization of your journals in a searchable format so that you can find them quite easily. And it also, these will allow the organization of web pages, books, and PDFs. And so I think that this is a necessary skill for all people who are going to be interventional radiologists. And I may be preaching to the choir. I'm sure a lot of you probably already do this, but I do know good doctors who don't have this skill, and it does kind of hamper them both clinically and from a research standpoint. So from the standpoint of writing papers, that's hard. I would say the most important thing that you can possibly do to get good at writing good papers is read. Read a lot of papers, and when you find somebody who really writes well and that you really like, read more of their papers, because you have to develop your own voice. You know, people sometimes try to be very dry in their papers and make their papers sort of like very descriptive without a lot of like personality in the paper, and that really is a mistake, because you can end up sort of not getting your data across if people don't really find interest in what you read. And I'll tell you, the best way to do it is just to read other people's papers who you really like. And I will give you an example. You can be a spectacular scientist and not be that good a writer. I don't know if any of you know who this guy is. He actually was my PhD advisor's PhD advisor, or postdoctoral advisor. He did some research work, won one of these for a single paper that he wrote, and yet after having written that paper and that paper being submitted, he actually almost did not get tenure at Oxford, where he was on faculty, because when he submitted his packet for tenure assessment, it wasn't interesting enough, didn't sound flashy enough to the committee, and so the committee actually decided not to give him tenure, to which his chairman actually had to go and beg the committee to reconsider, because he knew that this guy was a brilliant scientist. And this is, of course, Hans Krebs. You can actually buy this Nobel Prize right now if you want to. It's actually up for auction. Starting bids at $250,000 if any of you have the money. A book that I would really recommend, and I don't tend to always recommend books just because, you know, everybody is a little different in what's interesting to them, but this guy is a spectacular writer, and his book is really great at getting started in writing papers and also getting started in writing grants. You don't just want to write papers, you want people to read those papers and actually, you know, sort of change their practice somewhat based on those papers. And just in case you think it is only my opinion, that this is a great book. This is the Amazon reviews on this particular book. So I would really recommend this book. I think it's really not just good at teaching you how to write papers, but it's actually a pretty interesting read. So I think that you would probably enjoy it if you read it. So the next skill that you really need as a physician or a scientist is sort of manipulation of data. And basically you're talking about stats. A lot of us have had stats in college, and this may not be such a big deal to you, and you will get some of this by reading papers, but it's really important to be able to A, interpret data that you read in other people's papers, and then kind of figure out how to sort of describe what data you have in your papers. And the only way to do that is to have at least some rudimentary statistics. And so this is a website, it's the Khan Academy, I'm sure some of you know it, but actually it does a really excellent job at teaching basic statistics. And if you get past that and you need more statistics and you'd like to know more, there's also another site called edX, if any of you have ever heard of this. And actually they have really excellent data analysis statistics classes that you can take that are quite, you know, sort of complete in describing all the statistics that you need to know without being a statistician. Now, you know, you can go from very basic on Khan Academy, do those modules, and you'll be able to understand all of the basic statistics you need to read the literature and to think about basic statistics. Or you can get to the point that you're doing courses like this, which are quite advanced with respect to data analytics. And so, you know, these are easily available and totally free online. With respect to presentation, again, I think you can be a spectacular doctor. You can do incredible work, incredible research work. But if nobody knows that you're any good at it because they fall asleep 3.5 minutes into every presentation you do, then you're obviously not going to affect the way that anybody thinks about the world. And so, you know, PowerPoint resources, most of us use PowerPoint. Pages is nice too. Sometimes it's easier to just use PowerPoint because in a lot of places you end up on an IBM clone computer, a lot of conferences and that sort of thing, and it can, you know, it can really jack up your presentation going back and forth from Mac to a PC. But so I tend to use PowerPoint myself, and Lynda is a really excellent website that can teach you a lot about PowerPoint. They have nice videos, you can go through it, and you know, I'm not trying to recommend that you spend a lot of money, but if you'll notice, I pulled up the webpage from lynda.com, and you'll see you can try it free for 10 days. So if you give yourself the time that you can spend 10 days to get through all those all the videos on PowerPoint, then you can actually do it all for free and then deactivate and be done with that. So anyway, when we get past those basic skills that everybody who wants to be an academic really needs in order to present your data effectively, write papers, and get promoted, you get into sort of more the meat of real research. And that's a lot more complicated, and you have to understand that a lot of people spend their entire lives studying this. You know, a Ph.D. averages 7.2 years for a person who's not an MD Ph.D. in the United States. And in some places, MD Ph.D.s can average as high as 11 years at Johns Hopkins and Stanford biomedical engineering programs. So this takes a long time, and so you are going to have to sort of invest some time to kind of pick up the skills so that you can compete, because, you know, doing great science is incredibly satisfying, but the fact is, in order to get somebody to pay for it, you have to be pretty good at knowing how to ask them for money. And the thing is that that's not an easy skill. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can end up in a situation where you're setting up experiments and you don't anticipate what the consequences are of a particular choice that you made, and you can get yourself in really bad trouble. The first thing I would tell you is that you should pick a great advisor. Everybody who has ever been a good researcher has had an advisor or had a you know, a PI who has helped them start doing experiments, and that person helps you with grant writing, they help you with experimental design, because the best way to learn how to design experiments is to say, I want to find this question, and this is how I'm going to do it. And then you go to your advisor and you say, what do you think about this? and they say, that's a terrible idea. You forgot about this, you forgot about this, you forgot about this, you forgot about this. And I have to tell you, I had spectacular PhD advisors, but you know, my little brother, who's also an MD PhD, his advisor was not that great. And it really, made his education take a whole lot longer than it should have. And it was really not the same kind of experience that I got during my science education. So picking somebody to be a PI if you're going to do a postdoctoral fellowship or a, you know, pre-doctoral fellowship, or picking someone to be your advisor or your mentor when you're a full faculty member, this is one of the most important things you can do to determine your success when you're talking about becoming a scientist. With respect to grant writing, I actually have to sort of throw a shout out to our societal resources. I've actually attended this grant writing workshop. It's a one-day workshop on a Saturday. It's like 1.5 days, to be perfectly honest, and it's not that expensive. It's really nice because you do get to network with some people who are also young scientists, physician scientists trying to learn how to do research, and it was actually very useful from the terms of how they described it to apply for grants. And so, you know, this workshop might be enough if you're applying for sort of small departmental grants and, you know, pilot grants in order to get some data to sort of scale to larger grants. And then the nice thing is they actually have the advanced course. So once you've done that course and you're starting to apply for this, they have a 1-year-long course that has 4 separate sessions. And basically the point of this entire course is to teach you how to write an R01, which is sort of the gold standard grant that you get from the NIH. Now, the funding lines for R01s have been between 7 and 15% for the last, you know, 15 years or so. So, you know, that means, you know, you got to be in the top 7% of the grants that they fund in order to get money from the NIH. And so that takes a lot of skill, and it's not something you can sort of learn on your own. The nice thing about this is that actually the way that this grant is structured, they sort of force your chairman of your department to pay for it, so you don't have to pay for it. And it also requires that you have a mentor who can help you in going through the grant writing. And I'm actually doing this course as well right now, working on one of my grants with a senior mentor who's been doing, you know, who's had several R01s and has been doing research for a very long time. And I think it's actually quite helpful. If you're intent on doing any research that involves animals, you have to get what's called an IACUC, or if you're at the National Institute of Health, an ICCUC, and that's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. The federal government basically appoints all institutions with a committee that makes sure that you're not doing anything that's sort of unethical with animals, and that you're not abusing animals in the course of your research training. So if you're doing, you know, cell culture and things like that, you don't really have to worry about this. But for any animal research, you have to do an IACUC. And the best way to actually get training on how to do this is to Google IACUC, IACUC, and your institution, because the rules are different everywhere, because the rules are determined by the institution. And as long as nothing seems bad to the federal government when they go to review your institutional rules, they don't really cause any trouble. So this is a purely local thing. And these pages universally have sort of information about the IACUC, how to get started, what you need in order to be eligible to do animal research. Because by and large, there's certain vaccinations you have in order to go into the animal vivariums. There's other things that you have to do, and it'll teach you how to write one of these IACUCs. And every IACUC in the country also has a veterinarian whose job it is to help you when you have trouble. So you start writing it, and then you send it for pre-review to the veterinarian, and then they help you decide what you need to change and that sort of thing. So, and they'll tell you about, you know, what drugs to use in appropriate situations and things along those lines. And so this is a really vital part of learning how to be a researcher, is actually, you know, sort of going through the IACUC website. And it's sort of choose your own adventure in a way, because it'll lead you to the next step. And every institution has one, so you should really, you know, insist on doing the one that's associated with your own institution. Now, Technology Transfer Office. This is a very important thing for people interested in research who also are clinicians. particularly in interventional radiology, since we're sort of this specialty of innovation, you need to, as soon as you find the institution you're going to, even for training, not just for, you know, being a faculty member, but also for training, if you have a great idea, it does not belong to you. It actually belongs to your institution. And the thing is, you want to make sure that you protect that idea as soon as possible. I myself have made the mistake that I thought of a really cool use for a device that wasn't thought of by the company who used that, who created that device, and I didn't realize you can patent other people's intellectual property if you think of a way to use it in which they haven't used it. Now, there's different rules, obviously. It's easy to patent something if it's your own device, as long as you have a prototype. But if you're using somebody else's device or somebody else's drug in a way that they haven't planned to use it, and you patent it, you can make a lot of money off that, but you have to do the animal experiments to prove that it works the way that you want it to work. Stanford University actually has made $5 billion with a B off of Avastin because they proposed a use for Avastin that was not the use that it was originally designed for. And so they made a ton of money because they patented that use of Avastin. And the technology transfer offices is where all the lawyers are. They're the people who know how to deal with ideas in a way that you don't. And so you really need to be very cognizant of the fact that anytime you get an idea, the very first thing you should do is talk to the technology transfer office. Do not, and they will have you fill out a short form. This is the one for the University of Colorado. It's called the Invention Submission Short Form. And basically, it's just a short description of what the invention is. And why you fill this out is because, as I told you, none of your ideas belong to you when you work for an institution. They all belong to the institution. If you give them this disclosure form, basically nobody else from your institution can now steal your idea. Because if they try to steal your idea, then it ends up being the technology transfer office won't let them do that. And it's also really a good idea if you're the kind of person that invents stuff, to make sure you know what your technology transfer office rules are with respect to how much everything gets. So if you work at the NIH, you are not allowed to get more than per year from an invention than the salary of a sitting U.S. senator. So that's where it tops out. You can't make any more money than that. Your invention can be worth $50 million a year, and you will get $267,000 a year for every year that it's patented and making money for the institution. My particular institution, actually 25% goes to me, 25% goes to my laboratory, and then the other 50% gets divvied up between the technology transfer office and the dean's office. And so it's really important to kind of know those rules before you do stuff so that you don't get yourself in trouble and get yourself taken advantage of. So you have an idea. You go to the TTO and they have to decide, is the idea original? Does the idea have commercial potential? What's the best path for development? And is the idea protectable? And that's not stuff that I want to worry about because I'm a scientist. I want to do my research and I want it to help people. But I want somebody else to be worried about what the laws are associated with this. And so this is actually the picture from one of my patents with our technology transfer office. And they can actually help you a lot going through where to go from that. They can develop the idea at the university. You can get a commercial license, grants to support research. There's a lot of things they can do to help you. But you know, they need to know that you have this idea, and they need to be sure that they're doing everything they can to protect the idea. You'd think it's really crazy, but one of the things you can do is, even if another company has a drug that you want to use and that company won't let you use the drug, technically you can actually make the drug as long as you're doing it not for profit, and getting a patent doesn't count as for profit. So as long as you're doing it for research purposes, I can call my technology transfer office. They can call the chemists at our institution and reconstitute a drug looking at the patent documents from the company who made it and give me the drug so I can experiment with it and potentially patent it without the other company having anything that they can do to really stop you from that. So it sounds a little weird, but you really, those rules are not obvious unless somebody has actually told you about that. And so it's a great idea if you're an idea person talk to your patent office as soon as you get the opportunity, and they can help you sort of navigate all this stuff. Unless, of course, you also have a law degree, but I don't, so they kind of do all that stuff for me. So I think that's about enough. I'm sure your brains are about to melt talking about laboratory research. But let's talk a little bit about the skills that you need for clinical research, because those are a little bit different. So the first thing that you're going to have to do, and it doesn't matter what institution you're at, because almost every major research center in the entire country participates in the CITY program, is you go to the laboratory advisor or research director for your department and ask them to give you a login for this program called the Collaborative Institute Training Initiative. And basically this is a bunch of modules that you have to fill out that are basically like, you know, responsible conduct of research modules to make sure that when you're doing human research, which is what you would be doing with clinical research, that you actually know all the rules and know the right way to do things and know how to protect patient autonomy and which populations are at risk and which are not. It doesn't really take that long to do these modules, but it is an absolute requirement of the federal government to comply with training in responsible conduct of research, and this gets you that. And so if your institution participates in this, which is about every institution that I know of, it actually helps them to check off a box, and you won't be able to submit any kind of research, human research, without having completed modules like these, or if your institution has its own particular institutional module, but they're all basically the same thing. They basically are just making sure you understand the appropriate conduct of research. So after that, you have to get what's called IRB approval. So Institutional Review Board is what IRB stands for. And basically, they have to prove to the federal government anytime anybody asks, and they also have to prove to the Joint Commissions on Hospital Accreditation that you at your institution are conducting research in a way that protects patients. Otherwise, you can't do research on patients. And so they take this very, 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 very seriously. And in order to even publish a paper on a retrospective paper on stuff that happened to your patients, you have to actually get IRB approval to submit that paper. The only sort of exception to that is you can publish quality improvement papers as quality improvement papers, saying this is a quality improvement study without getting COMERB approval, but there's a lot of journals who won't even take those papers, and so you're better off just applying for IRB approval for everything. And the rules are obviously pretty lax if it's a retrospective study, because basically what they're trying to do is make sure that the patients aren't being exposed to extra risk, and if they are, that you're getting the patient's permission to do that. That's basically the job of at my institution it's called the COMERB, but most places it's called the IRB, because the University of Colorado shares a single multiple institutional review board. But basically there are, if you Google IRB and then your institution, it'll tell you all of the things that you have to do in order to submit an initial submission, and it'll even give you examples on what studies look like and what kind of approval to apply for. So for instance, you know, if I'm doing a retrospective review of outcomes of filters at my institution, that's usually not a complete review by the review board, and it's a pretty quick approval, and they don't give you too hard of a time as long as they feel like you're protecting, you're being HIPAA compliant and protecting people's private information. Now, when I want to do a prospective randomized study, that's a whole different thing, and the threshold for doing anything prospective, A, you will always have to do a special consent for the procedure, but B, it requires full review of the entire board, and they have a statistician look at all your numbers and all that sort of thing. And so it's a much bigger deal, and often, depending on your institution, my institution will tend to waive the fees based on if it's a investigator-initiated non-industry sponsored trial, they'll waive the fees and just let me do it by myself. But at some institutions, such as University of California, where I trained, you will actually have to pay about $10,000 or $15,000 for an IACUC approval for a prospective randomized study. And so it's really good idea to go to this. If you're interested in setting up a clinical trial or clinical study of some kind, it's really a good idea to go to these sites and make sure that you understand the regulatory environment of your institution. And again, this is totally dependent on where you're at, because this is not administered by the federal government, it's administered by your institution itself. And so if your institution got busted for something at some point, they're going to be a lot more careful about that particular aspect of protecting patients' autonomy, whereas if they haven't, then they probably will be a little bit more lax. And you know, in some states, the regulatory environment by the state government is a lot more restrictive than in others, and so that can make a big difference as to what even all the requirements are. And so this is something that's kind of really important to figure out wherever you're at. If you want to do clinical trials, again, there's a 6.5-day workshop. I have not taken this workshop, so I can't tell you if this one's any good, but I've heard that it's really good from the 5 people from my institution who've actually gone have all said that it's actually really very, very helpful. And a couple of them have actually set up clinical trials that were really well done. So there's no fee for this course. You do have to provide your own travel expenses and hotel accommodations, but most institutions will actually pay for this. But basically, they tell you how to design clinical trials sort of from beginning to end. And it's actually a really good course talking to people that have gone to it. And again, the reason there's no SIR equivalent courses to these RSNA courses is because these are so well designed and so well done by the RSNA. And that's kind of why I would recommend that if you're interested in it, this is a good way to, in a very quick way, to learn a lot about clinical trial methodology. So if you're going to cooperate with industry, you will, and you decide that, okay, I'm going to go to BTG, and I'm going to propose a clinical trial with them, which I personally have done once already. And basically, you will get a form, and it's different for each institution, and it's a form that's called an IIS. And so if you're going to collaborate with a company, you need to ask them for their IIS form. And it's investigator-initiated study, and it's basically a very, very short form grant. There's usually not nearly as much in it as there is in a standard grant to anybody, but they basically want to know how much money you're asking for, what you're going to do with it, and then a lot of the actual design of the trial and that sort of thing is actually negotiated based on your interactions with the company. And so, but knowing to look for what their rules are for IIS, that's a really important thing, because that'll tell you what you have to do in order to talk to the company to talk about a clinical trial. And as I said, this is a biocompatible, it's a BTG form that they have you fill out. And then the next page just says, what do you want? Basically, amount of money and then what you're going to do with it. So in summary, for the clinical trials, this is something that institutions pay a lot of attention to. And so I would really, really take advantage of your departmental resources. And I would say, I asked actually my research coordinator her advice as to what things she said I should tell you are the most important when you're talking about doing clinical trials. And she said to only participate in research that you're passionate in. Otherwise, you won't put forth the effort needed to meet enrollment. And if you don't meet enrollment, the company gets mad at you and you're less likely to get funded for subsequent trials. And so that can be a big problem. Understand private health information. There's a lot more categories than most researchers realize, and a lot of this is very well thought out by these companies. So you need to read the protocols well and understand what is considered private health information, because you'd be surprised some of the things that can be considered private health information. You should conduct research with a protocol that you can follow without deviations and within the guidelines of your institution. Because if you don't, those are the things that can get you audited by the FDA. All clinical trials are actually supervised by the FDA, and as long as you're not deviating from the protocol, the FDA will not audit you. And you don't want to get an FDA audit. That's a bad news, and it takes a lot of time, and it's no fun. So don't do that. And then I think I probably have put most of you to sleep. So with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson, for that talk. It was incredibly informative and a lot of pearls that I think that most of us, that are new to most of us. We do have a few questions. First, Joshua had asked about website links. You had mentioned earlier that you were going to send out a handout with these things, right?
I'll send you the handout that has all the links. In fact, I can email it to you right now, but it's on my desktop. I just hadn't emailed it to you before the webcast.
No problem. Okay, and then the next question is from Fareed Riaz. He says, you spoke about the importance of finding a good mentor, but finding a mentor seems to be either trial or a lot of trial and error, somewhat luck. What do you suggest to find a good mentor quickly?
So the best way to find a good mentor is find former mentees and see what they say about him. People will not lie. If they had a terrible experience with their mentor, they will let you know. And so the best thing to do is, look for those kind of persons. So ask the questions. How helpful were they? How much did they talk to you? How available were they to you? Those kinds of things will tell you really quickly whether a person is going to be a good mentor. You know, some people say, oh, should I get a young person? Because a young person likely is really motivated to do a lot of work in order to do well, or do I get a senior person because they're super well funded and they're kind of on cruise control on their own research and they know how to really navigate all of the pit holes? And I would say that it's hard to say because, you know, some of both can be really good. My brother, after his first Ph.D. mentor, picked a different one, and this person was her first graduate student. And she was very aggressive and very good and very helpful, and he had a good experience with her. Both of the people that I worked for my Ph.D., I worked with the chairman of biochemistry at Indiana University, and then the scientific director of the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the NIH were my co-directors for my Ph.D. And they're both very senior guys, very well funded, very well known, and I had a spectacular experience, and they were super helpful and super good. So you want somebody who really seems like they're interested in your research. They're not trying to just put you on their CV because it'll help them get promoted quicker. And you want to ask them to talk to former trainees, because a trainee won't lie to you. They won't lie to you. They have no reason to. If they had a terrible experience, they're going to want to tell you how terrible it was. And if they had a great experience, then they'll tell you what was great about them. And then the other thing is, look for somebody whose personality kind of matches yours. Not that you have the same personality, but you don't dislike them when you talk to them. You know what I mean? Like a person who doesn't. Personality match is actually an important part of research. They have to be a person that you can have a good conversation with. They can give you valuable feedback, and it doesn't drive you crazy every time either they talk to you or you talk to them. So I would say look for personality and then talk to their former trainees.
Okay, sounds great. The next question is, what can an aspiring physician scientist do during residency to prepare for a transition to a faculty physician focusing on basic science and a research career?
So if you're doing radiology, I would say that you should look to do, there are a couple of grants that you can do during your residency. If you're interested in being an interventional radiologist or even just a general radiologist, there's something called the Holman pathway. And basically that lets you have 18 months of research during your residency that's paid for by the RSNA. And so that's a really helpful way to get some extra time. There's also a couple of federal grants that are available to do research, and some of them you don't even have, like if you're at, you know, South Alabama and you want to do research in radiology and they're not really doing that kind of research that you want to do, you can actually do, there's a couple of grants that you can do at other institutions even. So like you could go to the UCSF website and look for research fellowships during residency for radiologists, and you'll find the link to the page and they'll tell you how to apply. And I can tell you that while I was a resident, there were people who came from outside institutions who got to work with radiologists who were good mentors because they engaged in that T32. It's called a T32 program. And there's a lot of institutions that have institutional T32s, so it doesn't even really require that you do a very, very formalized application. It's just the institution gets to fund up to 3 students at a time or 4 students at a time, and then that pays for your stipend and pays for all your stuff, and then you do research during that time. And so those can be very helpful ways to sort of buff you up to get to the position that you can get one of those kind of research faculty positions when you're done with your residency.
I have a follow-up question to that answer. When you do those T32 programs, do you generally have to have a research idea in mind, or do you join in and do the research that they have going at their institution?
So generally you do the research that they have going at their institution because they give you, I think, $5,000 to fund your actual laboratory part of your experiment. So really you've got to be doing the stuff that your mentor is actually working on. So what you would do is if you were interested in a T32 program and you go to the UCSF website, you say, look, I'm interested in T32. You fill out a form that talks about why you're interested in doing research, but not so much what you're interested in doing. And then they will match you up to somebody who's doing research sort of in the area of interest that you have at UCSF. I can speak from UCSF standpoint just because, you know, that's where I was, but other institutions also do T32s. UCSF is, you know, one of the institutions that gets tons of NIH money, so, you know, they're a little bit more well developed. I'm not sure if all institutions allow you to sort of parachute into the T32 program, but for sure you can at UCSF.
Okay. Next question. Dr. Johnson, I have about 6 months off this year in which to do research with my mentor. I had also hoped during this time to try and pick up some skills to help me going forward research-wise. Are there any particular skills you think have been or will be particularly useful for an entry-level medical student / early resident trainees? Thanks for your advice.
That is a great question. I have to tell you, all of the stuff that I did when I was a graduate student was absolutely cutting edge. I was using things that had just barely been invented, and they're all totally obsolete now. So the issue is it takes a long time to get trained, and science continues to advance. And so I think that the skills that are more useful as opposed to specific laboratory-based skills, like I was doing liquid chromatography mass spectrometry during my PhD, and that was all like, you know, especially semi-quantitative, that was like super advanced at the time, but now it's basically old hat in a lot of ways. And so I would say that the skills you want to focus on are, all you really need to learn during a PhD is how to really read a paper well and be critical, how to write a grant in a way that's cogent and has a chance of being funded, to design experiments that are thoughtful and actually support what you're trying to evaluate, and then be able to present it. And so I would focus on those skills more than specific laboratory techniques. Sure, learn any laboratory technique that they will teach you, and some stuff hasn't changed that much. I mean, obviously, if you learn how to run an MRI, or you learn how to do CT-based math problems, or learn statistics very helpful. None of that is going to ever, you know, go away. But learning specific, you know, 2D gel electrophoresis or any of those kinds of crazy sort of things, a lot of that stuff changes so much in the 6 years that it takes you to go from being a medical student to being a faculty, that you're better off trying to make sure that you publish something and then learning those other critical skills to being a scientist.
Next question. Of the clinical workshops you mentioned, are all of these specific for attending, or are there any that are geared towards residents? And if so, which would you suggest would be the, quote, best fit for us?
What was the first part of the question? I missed that.
So the clinical workshops, like for instance the RSNA workshops that you mentioned, are these all geared towards attendings, or are some of these geared towards residents that be a good fit for us during training?
So you could actually do them during training. There were residents at the RSNA one-day clinical skills. There was a guy from Hopkins there the last time that I went, who was a resident. The thing is, these are designed to help you learn how to apply for those grants and such yourself. How to be a trainee, you sort of be a trainee is the idea, but these are to help you learn how to be independent. You can't apply for an R01 until you have a faculty position, but that doesn't mean you can't know how to apply for one. And that doesn't mean you can't apply for other grants that actually are specific to fellows and residents. So I actually think that these grants workshops are really good, even if you are a resident or fellow. I don't think that they're above your level of training, if that's the kind of question that you mean, because they're all skills that none of us learned in residency. And so you get the skills because you're there, and it's completely different than anything that you'll learn as a radiologist. It's just being able to ask a good question is the only thing that is really requisite to actually take those courses. So as long as you can get somebody to pay for them, you probably don't want to pay the $225 yourself, It's easier if you're faculty because they always give you academic money that you can use to pay for workshops like this. But you can get grants from your institution to send you as well, especially as a resident. And the clinical skills workshop, which a lot of residents attend, actually is free. So I think that these are not workshops that are specific to faculty.
Okay. So what are your thoughts about research fellowships, the one-year research fellowships that you can do before or after IR fellowship? Are these worth it, or can you learn most of those skills on the job?
It depends on which ones you're talking about. If you look at like the Howard Hughes Fellowship, which you can do during your medical training, actually the people who do the Howard Hughes Fellowship statistically do just as well as the people who do non-MSTP MD PhDs. There's two kinds of MD PhDs. There's the ones that are, there's the 22 institutions that are funded by the federal government, and then the rest of them are funded through the institutions themselves. And so if you look at the institutions that are not MSTP, the Howard Hughes Fellows do just as well as any of those institutions from the standpoint of career success. So I think that that is really a lot of bang for your buck to get the equivalent of a PhD in a one-year research fellowship. For some of the ones during residency, I think that they can be extraordinarily helpful, and in a large part, there are some people who know all this stuff. They can learn it all on their own, but you still need to prove to somebody that you have the research background in order to do experiments. It was really telling for me when I was a graduate student at Indiana. I was working with a guy who's on my research committee. His name is Gordon McLennan. He's actually the program director at Cleveland Clinic, and he was in Indiana at the time. And he wrote a grant for a research study, and it was a very well-written grant, and my PhD advisor actually reviewed it for him and said, this is a great grant, I think it should be funded. And he submitted it, and it didn't even get scored, which that's bad. That means that you have no chance of being funded if they don't score you. That means that they didn't think you were in the top part of, you weren't among the top grants if they don't score you. And he asked for feedback from the committee, which you can do, and their feedback was, it's a great grant, it's very well written, it all seems very achievable, you did a nice job writing it, but we don't think you have the background to do this work. And so in addition to teaching you some of these skills that I'm talking about, it also gives you some credibility when you're applying for grants, because people are going to want to believe that you can do the work that you promised them that you're going to do when you're applying for grants. So from that standpoint, I think it's highly helpful. And also it'll help you with getting a job at a place that wants researchers. If you say, I'm really, really interested in research, and you have no papers on your background, and you have no research training besides being an MD, you may find that people are a little skeptical that you're really all that interested in research. And so it gives you credibility to those people too. Does it change who you are from the standpoint of what you're curious about and how smart you are and all those sorts of things? Not really. And you can learn all those skills on your own if you want, but it does give you credibility when you're applying for grants and applying for faculty positions in which research is a requisite. And also, to be perfectly honest with you, doing research is extremely helpful for getting residencies at the most competitive programs. I went to UCSF, and my year was the second most competitive year ever for radiology applications, and of my class, 9 of 13 had MD PhDs. So that gives you an idea of kind of what they were looking for. And so that's not true universally, but if that is what you're interested in, if you're interested in being a physician scientist, then that is something that can help you from the standpoint of your credentials, not just your actual ability to perform research.
Okay, great. This question was a follow-up question to one you answered previously. The previous question was about the 6 months and developing skills in those 6 months that he had during residency. And then his follow-up question was, do you have resources for those skills that you have used with success, the ones you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, that's what the, for the statistics, yeah, that was kind of what I was going through a little bit in the talk. The statistics I think you can learn from those online resources that I talked about. You can actually learn a lot from reading textbooks, or not textbooks, but the book that I talked about on reading science that's really helpful, and then actually watching how other people design stuff. It can be very helpful to find a mentor that will let you work with them and ask them about, how do I do science? Because they can sort of guide you through, and it's not just them telling you, it's not just reading a book, but they can actually show you in a real world way. Just about anybody will let you work in their laboratory for a few months, especially if you're not looking to be paid for it, you know what I mean? Like, you're not asking them to pay your stipend for the year or something, but just about anybody will let you come and work in their lab to see how a lab is run and how people do research work. And so I would say the books that I suggested, the website that I suggested, the AAAS website, have a lot of resources that you can go through, and those will take some time to learn. But you can learn all those skills and have that down by the time you're actually trying to do some research, and that'll facilitate a lot and make things a lot quicker. And all of those are included on that 2-page document that I'm going to upload tonight.
Okay, I think this is our last question. Sometimes it seems like results are the only thing that matters in research, either a paper, a poster presentation, or an oral presentation. In your opinion, how important are, quote, results such as these, and should you change your approach if you aren't getting these kinds of results?
So I think if you're being really persistent, you will get results, because you will fail, and then somebody will tell you what they want you to do different, and you'll do it, and you'll get better. Do I think that that's the only important thing about research? Absolutely not. I have to tell you, I'm a much better doctor because I know a lot about the literature, especially in my area. My Ph.D. is in liver physiology, and I go to tumor board, and I can talk in a way that other people who are in my specialty can't talk, because I can read the literature, because I know a lot about liver physiology. I have skills that other people don't have, and so my research background makes me a better doctor, makes me a better clinician, and that has nothing to do with whether I publish a paper or whether my grant gets funded, because those are things I got from reading the literature and thinking critically about the literature and approaching things with a scientific approach and not just being anecdotal, which a lot of doctors are. I had a really bad outcome one time when I did this, therefore I'm not doing that anymore. Well, if you're thinking like a scientist, that's not really the way that your brain works. And so you can get a ton out of not getting good results. Just so you know, the Hans Krebs paper that I talked about, that is the most important biochemical paper of the 20th century. There's no question. There's no other paper that's even close. Even, you know, Watson and Crick's paper on DNA, not even close, relative to the impact that it had in the world. It basically explained all of metabolism. And when Hans Krebs wrote the paper originally, he submitted it to Nature, which, you know, you can understand since it was a really important piece of data, and they told him that they didn't want a revision. It just wasn't interesting enough to be published in Nature. So he actually published it in biochemistry. And so he got a negative result trying to publish it in Nature, but he didn't give up. And just because other people don't necessarily see the importance of what you do doesn't mean it's not important, and doesn't mean that it doesn't inform the rest of your practice, especially as a physician.
I have one follow-up question to your answer. So you mentioned how your background in liver physiology helps you be a better doctor, get better IR. And what other ways did your basic science background affect your way to of practicing medicine?
So I'm a little better at stats than most people who are physicians. When clinicians start talking about pathways, my eyes don't roll back in my head. I still know the citric acid cycle by heart, to be perfectly honest with you. And so the thing is, when I'm thinking about the mechanism of something, when somebody says to me, okay, this drug, it inhibits glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, Dr. Geschwin's drug that he uses, or that he has been using in his case. I don't know if any of you have heard him speak, but it's actually a glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase inhibitor. When he says that, I can look at him and go, so what are you doing about the hypoglycemia that you're causing in your patients? And he looks at me like I'm insane, and how did I know that, and was I spying on his laboratory? But the fact of the matter is, I understand the mechanism of this enzyme, and so understanding the physiology makes it easier to understand how what we do interacts with that physiology. And glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is a bifunctional enzyme that's responsible for both glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. And because it's responsible for gluconeogenesis, I knew that he was going to get he was going to make his patients have high lactate and their sugar was going to go low. And that's the way that I knew that. And so it informs the way that I read papers. It informs the way that I interact with those papers based on my physiology background. And so I don't think I would be nearly as good a doctor as I am if I had not gotten a Ph.D. And that's not true for everybody. But for me, I think it's vital because it informs how I approach everything. I think about it I start from the physiology and then I scale that to what I expect to see clinically. And that's the beautiful thing about being a clinician scientist is physiologists who are just physiologists, they think about the physiology and then they scale it down until they break it into pieces that can't possibly be wrong because you've taken off all the extraneous material. But that doesn't necessarily tell them anything about how it affects the patient. But when I look at something like this, I immediately in my head it scales to the patient and how does it affect the patient. And so that gives you a lot of, it gives you the ability to have a very nuanced view of medicine. You don't just think, oh, this is a disease that I treat with this drug. You think, oh, how does this drug affect the physiology? Should I give more? Should I give less? It just gives you a more nuanced view. You know what I'm saying?
Definitely. Well, Dr. Johnson, I think that's all the questions that people have submitted. Thank you so much for your time. It was incredibly informative and definitely different than most of the webinars that we receive, a different perspective. So thanks again for your time.
No problem. And I'll send you that piece of paper right now.
Awesome. Thanks.
No problem.
Everyone have a good night.